Welcome, traveler of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Medieval Europe was a world where invisible killers stalked every village, castle, and monastery, where the simple act of breathing could seal your fate, where entire bloodlines vanished overnight, and where the dead often outnumbered the living. This wasn't a world conquered by armies or destroyed by natural disasters. This was a civilization under siege by microscopic enemies that no sword could defeat, and no wall could keep out. The diseases that ravaged medieval Europe weren't just medical curiosities. They were forces of history that toppled kingdoms, ended dynasties, and reshaped the very fabric of society. They determined who lived to rule and who died in obscurity. They decided which ideas survived and which knowledge was lost forever. In many ways, the story of medieval Europe is not the story of kings and queens, knights and peasants, but the story of humanity's struggle against an invisible army of pathogens that showed no mercy to rich or poor alike. When we think of medieval death, we often imagine the battlefield, the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, the desperate cries of warriors. But the truth is far more terrifying. For every person who died by the sword, dozens more fell to diseases that struck without warning, spread without explanation, and killed without discrimination. These weren't just illnesses, they were apocalyptic events that could empty entire cities in weeks, leaving behind nothing but silence and the stench of death. The medieval world had no understanding of germs, no concept of contagion, and no defense against the biological warfare that nature waged against them daily. They lived in a time when a simple cut could lead to an agonizing death, when childbirth was a gamble with mortality, and when the very air they breathed could carry their doom. They attributed these calamities to divine wrath, to sin, to the alignment of stars, never knowing that their greatest enemies were creatures too small to see, yet powerful enough to bring empires to their knees. Consider for a moment what it must have been like to wake up each morning, not knowing if this would be the day that death came calling, to watch your children sleep and wonder if they would see another dawn, to kiss your spouse goodbye and realize it might truly be goodbye forever. This was the reality for millions of people across medieval Europe, living under the constant shadow of diseases that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The deadliest diseases of medieval history weren't just medical phenomena. They were the invisible hands that shaped the course of human civilization. They determined which cities thrived and which became ghost towns. They influenced which trade routes flourished and which were abandoned. They decided which cultural movements spread and which died in their cradles. Every major decision, every political alliance, every religious movement of the medieval period was made against the backdrop of omnipresent death. What makes these diseases so fascinating and terrifying is not just their lethality, but their complete indifference to human hierarchies. A king's crown offered no protection against the plague. A knight's armor was useless against smallpox. A priest's prayers couldn't stop typhus. Death was the great equalizer, and disease was its most efficient servant in the medieval world. Your social status, your wealth, your power meant nothing when faced with microscopic killers that recognized no earthly authority. The impact of these diseases went far beyond the immediate horror of death and suffering. They triggered massive social upheavals, economic collapses, and religious crises that reverberated across centuries. When the Black Death killed a third of Europe's population, it didn't just create empty villages, it destroyed. The feudal system triggered peasant revolts, inspired new forms of art and literature, and fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with mortality. These diseases weren't just taking lives, They were rewriting the story of human civilization. But perhaps most chilling of all is how unprepared medieval society was for these biological catastrophes. They had no hospitals, as we understand them. No public health systems. No scientific understanding of disease transmission. When plague struck, their response was often to pray, harder punish supposed sinners more severely, or flee in panic. They were fighting a war they didn't understand against an enemy they couldn't see, using weapons that were utterly ineffective. The medical knowledge of the time was a dangerous mixture of ancient superstition, religious doctrine, and well-meaning ignorance. Physicians prescribed treatments that often killed faster than the diseases themselves. They bled patients who were already weak, poisoned them with mercury, and tortured them with procedures that would be considered barbaric today. In trying to heal, they often hastened death. In seeking to cure, they frequently spread contagion. Yet even in this dark age of medicine, there were glimmers of understanding. Some medieval physicians began to notice patterns in disease outbreaks. They observed that certain conditions seemed to spread from person to person. They noticed that some locations were more dangerous than others. These early epidemiologists, working without microscopes or modern scientific methods, laid the groundwork for our current understanding of public health, often paying for their insights with their own lives. The deadliest diseases of medieval history also reveal the incredible resilience of the human spirit, faced with horrors that would break modern societies. Medieval people found ways to adapt, survive, and even thrive. They developed new forms of social organization. They created new economic systems. They found new ways to make meaning from suffering and hope from despair. Their survival is a testament to humanity's remarkable ability to endure even the darkest chapters of history. These diseases shape not just how medieval people lived, but how they died. Death in the medieval world was often public, communal, and deeply ritualized. When disease struck, entire communities would gather to pray, to mourn, to comfort the dying, and support the survivors. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and nursing homes, but was an ever-present part of daily life. This intimacy with mortality gave medieval culture a depth and urgency that is difficult for us to comprehend today. The economic impact of these diseases was staggering. Trade routes were abandoned when merchants feared contagion. Entire industries collapsed when their workers died. On mass agricultural production plummeted when farmers succumbed to plague. The wealth of nations rose and fell, based not on military conquest or diplomatic skill, but on their ability to survive biological catastrophes. Disease was perhaps the most powerful economic force in medieval Europe, capable of destroying decades of prosperity. In a matter of months, religious institutions, which dominated medieval life, were forced to grapple with theological questions that had no easy answers. If God was benevolent and all-powerful, why did innocent children die horrible deaths from disease? If prayer and piety were protection against evil, why did the most devout often suffer the most? These diseases challenged fundamental beliefs about divine justice, human worth, and the nature of existence itself. They sparked religious reforms, inspired new theological movements, and sometimes shattered faith entirely. The deadliest diseases of medieval history also had profound effects on art, literature, and culture. The omnipresence of death inspired some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. The haunting beauty of medieval religious art, with its focus on suffering and redemption. The dark humor of medieval literature, which found laughter in the face of horror. The elaborate death rituals and memorial practices that created some of our most enduring cultural traditions. These diseases didn't just destroy, they also created inspiring human creativity in the face of unimaginable loss. What's perhaps most remarkable about these medieval diseases is how they continue to influence our world today. Many of the public health measures we take for granted, quarantine, sanitation systems, disease surveillance, were first developed in response to medieval epidemics. The very concept of public health, the idea that governments have a responsibility to protect their citizens from disease, emerged from the ashes of medieval catastrophes. We are still living with the institutional and cultural legacy of humanity's medieval struggle against disease. Understanding these diseases also helps us appreciate how far we've come and how fragile our progress remains. The same pathogens that terrorized medieval Europe are still with us today. The difference is not that we've eliminated them, but that we've learned to control them through science, sanitation, and social organization. Yet as recent global events have reminded us, we remain vulnerable to biological threats that can disrupt our societies in ways that would be familiar to any medieval chronicler. The deadliest diseases in medieval history were more than just medical emergencies. They were civilization-defining events that shaped everything from political structures to artistic expression, from economic systems to religious beliefs. They remind us that human history is not just the story of what we've built, but also the story of what we've survived. They show us that our ancestors faced challenges that would test the limits of human endurance, and somehow found the strength to not just survive, but to create the foundations of the world we inhabit today. As we delve deeper into these dark chapters of human history, we'll discover that the medieval world's relationship with disease was complex, multifaceted, and ultimately transformative. These weren't just stories of death and suffering, but stories of adaptation, innovation, and the remarkable human capacity to find meaning and hope, even in the darkest of circumstances. The deadliest diseases in medieval history didn't just take lives, they forged them, shaped them, and ultimately made us who we are today in the shadowy corridors of medieval Europe, where the flickering flames of countless candles barely pierced the perpetual twilight. A silent war was being waged, not between armies or kingdoms, but between humanity and the unseen forces of disease and death. As we continue our journey through the most devastating ailments that shaped the Middle Ages, we must now turn our attention to a collection of maladies that, while perhaps less notorious than the Black Death, nonetheless carve their own bloody swaths through the populations of Europe. The specter of disease in medieval times was not merely the stuff of nightmares. It was the harsh reality that governed every aspect of daily existence from the moment a child drew their first breath in a world devoid of modern sanitation, to the final moments when families gathered around deathbeds in cramped, vermin-infested hovels. Illness was the unwelcome companion that shadowed every step of human life. These diseases did not discriminate. They struck down peasant and prince alike, though the poor, weakened by malnutrition and living in squalid conditions, bore the heaviest burden in the fetid air of medieval cities, where human waste mingled with animal refuse in the narrow streets, and where the concept of hygiene was as foreign as the distant lands beyond the known world. Disease found fertile ground to flourish. The very foundations of medieval society, its rigid class structure, its religious dogma, its primitive understanding of medicine, all conspired to create perfect conditions for epidemic after epidemic to ravage the continent. Consider, if you will, the plight of a typical medieval family during one of these outbreaks. Picture them huddled in their single-room dwelling, sharing their meager space with livestock, whose warmth was essential for survival. During the brutal winter months, the father, perhaps a blacksmith or a farmer, would continue his labors, even as fever racked his body, for to cease working meant starvation for his family. The mother, already weakened by frequent childbirth and poor nutrition, would tend to sick children with remedies passed down through generations, remedies that were more often harmful than helpful. The children themselves faced the most precarious existence of all, with infant mortality rates that would horrify modern sensibilities. It was considered remarkable if half of a family's children survived to adulthood. Those who did reach maturity bore the scars of their struggle: stunted growth from malnutrition, missing teeth from scurvy, and the pallor of those who had danced too often with death and somehow lived to tell the tale. But it was not merely the physical toll that these diseases extracted from medieval society. They fundamentally altered the very fabric of European civilization, shaping everything from religious practices to economic systems, from artistic expression to social hierarchies. When plague struck a community, it did not simply kill it. transformed villages that had thrived for centuries were abandoned overnight, their fields returning to wilderness, their churches standing empty as monuments to vanished congregations. The psychological impact was equally profound in a world where life was already brutish. And short, the constant threat of epidemic disease created a mindset of fatalistic acceptance mixed with desperate superstition. People sought answers in the stars, in the humors of the body, in the supposed sins of their communities. They turned to prayer and pilgrimage, to bleeding and purging, to charms and amulets. Anything that might offer protection against the invisible enemies that stalked them. Medieval medicine, such as it was, remained trapped in the amber of ancient Greek and Roman theories, mixed with a heavy dose of Christian theology and folk wisdom. Physicians, when they could be found and afforded, prescribed treatments based on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of these bodily fluids, and their treatments often involved bleeding, purging, or the administration of herbs and minerals that were as likely to kill as to cure. The very language used to describe illness reveals the medieval mindset. Diseases were often seen as punishments from God for individual or collective sins, or as tests of faith that the righteous must endure. This spiritual interpretation of illness meant that medical treatment was often intertwined with religious ritual, and that recovery was attributed more to divine intervention than to any earthly remedy. Yet within this framework of ignorance and superstition, there were glimmers of genuine medical knowledge. Infirmaries served as repositories of healing wisdom, where monks carefully copied and preserved the medical texts of antiquity. These religious institutions often provided the only organized health care available to the common people, and their herb gardens supplied the raw materials for countless remedies. The monasteries also served as centers of medical learning, where the accumulated knowledge of generations was passed down from master to pupil. The role of women in medieval medicine cannot be overlooked. While formal medical education was reserved for men, women served as the primary caregivers in their communities. Midwives assisted in childbirth, herbalists gathered and prepared medicinal plants, and countless mothers and wives nursed their families through illness with a combination of practical knowledge and tender care. These women, though often dismissed or even persecuted as witches when their remedies failed, were in many ways the backbone of medieval healthcare. As we delve deeper into the specific diseases that plagued medieval Europe, we must remember that each outbreak was not merely a medical event, but a social, economic, and cultural catastrophe that rippled through every level of society. The diseases we will examine, from the mysterious sweating sickness that terrified Tudor England to the relentless march of leprosy that created an entire class of social outcasts. Each tells a story not just of human suffering, but of human resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. These were times when a simple scratch could lead to death, when childbirth was a gamble with mortality, when the arrival of strangers in a town might herald not trade and news, but pestilence and death. Yet somehow, miraculously, civilization endured. People continued to love and laugh, to create and build, to hope and dream. Even as the shadow of disease darkened their doorsteps, the weapons they wielded against these invisible enemies were pitifully inadequate by modern standards. Prayers and purges, bleeding and burning, quarantine and superstition. Yet these medieval people possessed something that perhaps we have lost in our modern age of medical miracles: an acceptance of mortality that allowed them to find meaning and beauty in lives that were often brief and always uncertain. Their art reflected this preoccupation with death and disease. The dance macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic theme, showing skeletons, leading people from all walks of life, from popes to peasants. In a final equalizing dance, churches were adorned with memento mori, reminders of death that urged the faithful to prepare their souls for the inevitable journey to the afterlife. Literature, too, was suffused with themes of mortality and the transience of earthly existence. The economic impact of these diseases was equally transformative. Labor shortages caused by epidemic mortality led to increased wages for survivors, contributing to the gradual breakdown of the feudal system. Trade routes were disrupted as merchants feared to travel to infected areas. Yet at the same time, the demand for luxury goods among the wealthy survivors created new opportunities for commerce. Entire industries from textiles to agriculture had to adapt to radically altered demographics. Religious life, too, was profoundly affected. The failure of prayers and pilgrimages to stem the tide of disease led some to question the established order of the church, while others doubled down on their faith, seeing suffering as a path to salvation. New religious movements emerged, some emphasizing personal piety and direct communion with the divine, others focusing on charitable works and care for the sick. The great cathedral building projects of the High Middle Ages gave way to smaller, more intimate religious foundations dedicated to caring for the diseased and dying. Perhaps most significantly, these diseases served as great equalizers in a society otherwise rigidly stratified by birth and wealth. A peasant's fever was indistinguishable from a lord's, and the grave made no distinction between the noble and the common. This shared vulnerability to disease created paradoxically both greater compassion for human suffering and a heightened awareness of social inequalities that would eventually contribute to social and political upheavals. The medieval response to epidemic disease also laid the groundwork for many modern public health practices. Quarantine, though often brutally enforced, represented an early understanding of contagion. The establishment of hospitals and infirmaries, initially by religious orders, created the institutional framework that would eventually evolve into modern healthcare systems. Even the primitive attempts at record-keeping during outbreaks contributed to the development of epidemiology. As we embark on this exploration of medieval diseases, we must steel ourselves for tales of almost unimaginable suffering. We will encounter symptoms so severe and mortality rates so high that they strain our modern comprehension. We will meet diseases with names that have passed from common knowledge: the king's evil, the falling sickness, the bloody flux, yet whose impacts shaped the course of European history. But we will also discover stories of remarkable human endurance and ingenuity. We will learn of the brave souls who risked their lives to care for the sick, of the scholars who preserved and transmitted medical knowledge across generations, of the communities that found ways to support their most vulnerable members, even in the darkest of times. The diseases we will examine in this continuation of our journey through medieval medical history serve as windows into a world both alien and familiar, alien in its acceptance of mortality and suffering as inevitable parts of human existence, yet familiar in its fundamental human responses to crisis, the search for meaning, the bonds of compassion, the stubborn refusal to surrender hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. These medieval melodies remind us that disease has always been humanity's companion, shaping not only our biology, but our culture, our societies, and our souls. In understanding how our ancestors confronted these challenges, we gain insight not only into the past, but into the enduring human condition itself. For while we may have conquered many of the diseases that terrorized medieval Europe, we continue to face new challenges that test our resolve, our compassion, and our ingenuity in ways that would be all too familiar to a medieval physician or a plague-stricken family. The story of medieval disease is ultimately the story of humanity itself, fragile, yet resilient, mortal, yet enduring forever, struggling against the forces that would destroy us, yet somehow finding the strength to build, to love, to hope, and to pass on to future generations. The hard-won wisdom gleaned from our encounters with suffering and death. The medieval period was defined by relentless waves of disease that swept across Europe with terrifying regularity, while the Black Death of the 14th century stands as perhaps the most infamous pandemic in human history. It was merely one chapter in a centuries-long story of medical horror that shaped the very fabric of medieval society. Beyond the plague, a constellation of deadly ailments stalked the population with merciless persistence, Smallpox erupted in festering pustules across the skin, leaving survivors permanently scarred. If they were fortunate enough to live, typhoid fever ravaged communities through contaminated water sources, while tuberculosis slowly consumed its victims from within, earning the grim nickname the wasting disease. Influenza struck in devastating waves, and dysentery turned the simple act of eating into a potential death sentence. What made these diseases so particularly devastating in medieval times was the complete absence of medical understanding that we take for granted today. Without knowledge of germs, bacteria, or viruses, medieval physicians operated in a world of dangerous ignorance. They attributed illness to an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, leading to treatments that were often more harmful than the diseases themselves. Bloodletting was prescribed for nearly every ailment, weakening patients when they most needed their strength. Physicians would apply leeches or make deliberate cuts to drain what they believed was corrupted blood, often hastening death rather than preventing it. Other common treatments included purging the bowels with violent laxatives, inducing vomiting, and exposing patients to extreme heat or cold to rebalance their humors. The lack of sanitation created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Medieval cities were cesspools of human and animal waste, with garbage and sewage flowing through the streets. People lived in close quarters with their livestock, sharing cramped spaces where fleas, lice, and rats thrived. Wells and water sources were frequently contaminated, turning the basic necessity of drinking water into a game of Russian roulette. Personal hygiene was virtually non-existent among the general population. Most people bathed perhaps once or twice a year, if at all. The wealthy might wash their hands and faces occasionally, but the concept of washing to prevent disease was completely foreign. Clothing was rarely cleaned, and people often wore the same garments for months on end, creating walking incubators for parasites and pathogens. Medieval hospitals, run primarily by religious orders, were places where the sick went to die rather than recover. These institutions were more concerned with the spiritual welfare of patients than their physical healing. The dying were packed together in large halls, where diseases spread like wildfire from bed to bed. The primary medical intervention was prayer, supplemented by herbal remedies of dubious effectiveness. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of disease cannot be overstated. Medieval people developed a fatalistic worldview where death could strike at any moment without warning or reason. This uncertainty permeated every aspect of life, from family planning to economic decisions. Parents could not reasonably expect their children to survive to adulthood, and marriages were often cut short by sudden illness. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Entire trade networks collapsed when plague struck major cities. Agricultural production plummeted as farmers died in the fields, leaving crops to rot. Unharvested skilled craftsmen and their knowledge disappeared overnight, setting back technological and cultural progress by generations. The social order itself was constantly disrupted as disease claimed nobles and peasants alike, though the poor inevitably suffered disproportionately. Religious faith both sustained people through these orals and sometimes made them worse. Many viewed disease as divine punishment for sin, leading to extreme acts of penance that further weakened immune systems. Flagellant movements saw people whipping themselves bloody in public displays of repentance. Jews and other minority groups were scapegoated and massacred during plague outbreaks, blamed for poisoning wells or bringing God's wrath upon Christian communities. Yet even in this landscape of medical ignorance and suffering, there were glimmers of progress. Some medieval physicians began to observe patterns in disease transmission, laying the groundwork for future understanding. The concept of quarantine emerged during plague outbreaks, with infected ships forced to wait offshore before entering ports. Hospitals, despite their limitations, represented early attempts at organized medical care and established precedents for institutional healing. The diseases of medieval times were democracy's great equalizer, striking down kings and peasants with equal ferocity. They shaped migration patterns, influenced religious thought, and drove technological innovation. As people sought any means to protect themselves, these invisible enemies were as powerful as any army capable of toppling kingdoms and reshaping the map of Europe. The legacy of medieval disease extends far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. The trauma of repeated pandemics left deep cultural scars that influenced art, literature, and philosophy for centuries. The dance macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves. This memento mori served as a constant reminder of mortality's universality and the futility of earthly pretensions. Understanding the disease environment of medieval Europe helps us appreciate not only how far medical science has advanced, but also the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, despite facing threats that would seem apocalyptic by modern standards. Medieval people continued to build, create, love, and hope. They developed coping mechanisms and social structures that allowed communities to survive even the most devastating outbreaks. Their struggle against these invisible enemies laid the foundation for everything we know about public health today. From the ashes of medieval medical ignorance, eventually arose the scientific method, germ theory, and the sophisticated medical infrastructure that protects us now. The suffering of our ancestors was not in vain, if it teaches us to value and protect the hard-won knowledge that keeps such horrors at bay. The medieval era was a time when survival itself was a daily battle, and nowhere was this struggle more evident than in humanity's relationship with disease. While today we might complain about a common cold or worry about a stomach bug, our medieval ancestors faced an entirely different reality. One where invisible enemies lurked in every breath of air, every sip of water, and every morsel of food. Picture, if you will, a world without antibiotics, without vaccines, without even the most basic understanding of what causes illness. Imagine living in a time when a simple cut could lead to death, when childbirth was a life-threatening gamble, and when entire communities could be wiped out by diseases whose names we barely remember today. This was the harsh reality for millions of people across medieval Europe, where death was not just a distant concept, but a constant companion that could arrive without warning. The medieval understanding of disease was a fascinating mixture of superstition, religion, and crude observation. Most people believed that illness was caused by bad air, or miasma, a theory that would persist for centuries. They thought that foul odor and corrupted atmosphere were the primary culprits behind the spread of disease. In reality, of course, it was often the very conditions that created these bad smells: poor sanitation, crowded living quarters, and contaminated water, sources that provided the perfect breeding grounds for the pathogens that would claim so many lives. The concept of contagion was poorly understood. If at all, people might notice that diseases seemed to spread from person to person, but they had no idea why or how. Some attributed it to divine punishment for sin, others to the alignment of the stars, and still others to the corruption of the air itself. This lack of understanding meant that efforts to prevent disease were largely ineffective, often based more on hope and ritual than on any scientific foundation. Medical knowledge in medieval times was a patchwork of ancient Greek and Roman texts, Islamic scholarship, folk remedies, and religious doctrine. The works of Galen and Hippocrates were still considered authoritative, even though many of their theories were fundamentally flawed. The dominant medical theory was that of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were thought to govern health and disease. According to this theory, illness occurred when these humors became imbalanced, and treatment involved trying to restore equilibrium through various means, many of which were more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common medical procedure of the time, prescribed for everything from headaches to heart problems. Physicians believed that removing blood would help rebalance the humors and cure the patient. In reality, this practice often weakened already sick individuals, making them more susceptible to infection and death. Similarly, purging through induced vomiting or diarrhea was thought to rid the body of corrupted humors, but instead often led to dangerous dehydration and further complications. The tools and techniques available to medieval physicians were primitive by today's standard. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, making it an agonizing and often fatal procedure. Instruments were crude and often reused without proper cleaning, spreading infection from patient to patient. Many surgical procedures that we consider routine today were simply impossible, and even minor operations carried a high risk of death from infection or shock. Herbal remedies formed the backbone of medieval medicine, and while some of these treatments had genuine therapeutic value, many were based more on superstition than science. The doctrine of signatures, for example, held that God had marked plants with signs indicating their medicinal uses. So a plant with heart-shaped leaves might be used to treat heart problems, regardless of its actual pharmacological properties, while some herbs did contain active compounds that could help treat certain conditions. The hit or miss nature of this approach meant that patients were just as likely to be harmed as helped. The role of religion in medieval medicine cannot be overstated. The Catholic Church taught that illness was often a punishment for sin or a test of faith, and many people believed that prayer and penance were more effective than any earthly remedy. Pilgrimage to holy sites was thought to cure disease, and the relics of saints were believed to have miraculous healing powers, while faith could provide psychological comfort to the suffering. It did little to address the underlying causes of disease. This religious framework also influenced how medical care was provided. Many hospitals were run by religious orders, and the focus was often more on spiritual care than physical healing. The sick were seen as an opportunity for the healthy to practice Christian charity, and caring for them was considered a religious duty. While this meant that some basic care was available to the poor, it also meant that medical treatment was often secondary to spiritual concerns. The typical medieval hospital bore little resemblance to modern medical facilities. They were often little more than hospices, where the sick could die with dignity, rather than places where they might actually recover. Conditions were frequently unsanitary, with multiple patients sharing beds, and little attention paid to preventing the spread of infection. The sick, the dying, and sometimes even the dead might be found side by side, creating an environment that was more likely to spread disease than cure it. For the vast majority of medieval people, medical care was a luxury they could rarely afford. Professional physicians were expensive and primarily served the wealthy, while most common folk had to rely on local wise women, barbers, surgeons, or their own knowledge of folk remedies. These healers often had more practical experience than university-trained doctors, but they lacked access to the best available knowledge and resources. The barber surgeons occupied a unique position in medieval medical hierarchy. Originally, these were simply barbers, who, in addition to cutting hair and shaving beards, performed minor surgical procedures, like tooth extraction and bloodletting. Over time, some became quite skilled at these tasks, but they were still considered inferior to university-trained physicians. The famous red and white striped barber pole actually originated from this practice, the red representing blood and the white representing bandages. Women played a crucial role in medieval healthcare, though their contributions were often overlooked or dismissed by mal-dominated medical institutions as midwives. They assisted with childbirth and cared for women's health issues. As wise women or herbalists, they maintained knowledge of medicinal plants and home remedies. Many women became skilled healers through necessity and experience, but they were also vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft if their treatments failed or if they were too successful, and thus seen as threatening to establish medical authority. The training of physicians in medieval times was largely theoretical rather than practical. Medical schools, when they existed, focused on studying ancient texts rather than observing actual patients. Students might spend years learning about the humors and reading Galen without ever examining a sick person. Dissection of human bodies was rare and often forbidden, meaning that knowledge of anatomy was based more on animal dissections and ancient texts than on actual human observation. This theoretical approach to medicine meant that treatments were often based on logical reasoning from flawed premises rather than empirical observation. If a patient had a fever, for example, the physician might reason that they had too much hot humor and needed cooling treatments regardless of what was actually causing the fever. This could lead to treatments that were not only ineffective but actively harmful. The concept of quarantine did exist in medieval times, though it was not well understood or consistently applied. The word itself comes from the Italian quaranti, meaning 40 days, the period that ships were required to wait before entering port during plague outbreaks. However, quarantine measures were often implemented too late or too inconsistently to be effective, and the lack of understanding about how diseases spread meant that they were frequently applied in ways that did little good. Medieval people did recognize that some diseases were more common in certain seasons or locations. They noticed that malaria was more prevalent in swampy areas, though they attributed this to bad air rather than mosquitoes. They observed that some diseases seemed to cluster in families or communities, though they couldn't explain why. These observations sometimes led to practical measures that had some benefit. Even if the underlying reasoning was flawed, the social impact of disease in medieval times extended far beyond individual suffering. Epidemics could destroy entire communities, leaving fields unharvested and trades abandoned. The economic consequences were severe as labor shortages drove up wages for survivors while reducing overall productivity. Social structures could be completely disrupted with established hierarchies overturned when disease struck down the powerful and spared the humble. Disease also served as a great equalizer in medieval society. While the wealthy might have access to better food and housing, they were not immune to epidemic diseases. Kings and peasants alike could fall victim to plague or smallpox, reminding everyone of their shared mortality. This universality of suffering may have contributed to the medieval fascination with death and the afterlife, as reflected in art, literature, and religious practices of the time. The psychological impact of living with constant disease and death cannot be underestimated. Medieval people developed a fatalistic worldview that accepted suffering and early death as natural parts of life. This is reflected in medieval art and literature, which often featured themes of mortality and the transience of earthly life. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif showing death as the great equalizer who comes for rich and poor alike. Yet, despite all these challenges, medieval people showed remarkable resilience in the face of disease and death. They developed coping mechanisms, both practical and psychological, that helped them endure unimaginable hardships. They created support networks within families and communities, shared resources during times of crisis, and found meaning in their suffering through religious faith and cultural traditions. The legacy of medieval approaches to disease is complex. While much of their medical knowledge was flawed or harmful, some practices did have value and contributed to the gradual development of more effective treatments. The hospital system, though primitive, established the principle that society had a responsibility to care for the sick. The preservation of classical medical texts by medieval scholars ensured that valuable knowledge was not lost entirely, and the gradual accumulation of practical experience, even when based on flawed theories, laid some groundwork for future medical advances. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience with disease taught humanity valuable lessons about the importance of public health, measures the need for systematic observation and experimentation in medicine, and the social responsibility to care for the vulnerable. These lessons, learned through immense suffering and loss, would eventually contribute to the development of modern medicine and public health systems that have dramatically reduced the burden of infectious disease. The story of medieval humanity's struggle against disease is ultimately one of endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us of how far we have come in our understanding and treatment of illness, while also highlighting the fundamental human capacity to adapt, survive, and eventually overcome even the most daunting challenges in their suffering and their persistence. Our medieval ancestors laid the foundation for the medical advances that protect us today. Looking at the provided script summary and reference materials, I'll continue the medieval diseases script with Part 5, focusing on maintaining the established tone and progression, while introducing new diseases and their societal impacts. But even as communities struggled to rebuild from the devastation of plague, other deadly afflictions continued to stalk the medieval world with relentless persistence. Leprosy, perhaps more than any other disease, embodied the profound fear and superstition that surrounded illness. In this era, the very mention of the word could strike terror into the hearts of even the bravest souls for it to contract. Leprosy was not merely to face death, but to endure a living hell of social exile and spiritual condemnation. The leper became a figure of both pity and revulsion, forced to wear distinctive clothing and ring bells to warn of their approach. Medieval society viewed leprosy as divine punishment for sin, a belief that transformed medical treatment into moral judgment. Leper houses, or lazarets, sprang up across Europe, ostensibly to care for the afflicted, but often serving more as prisons than hospitals. These institutions, while providing basic shelter and sustenance, effectively removed lepers from society, entirely condemning them to live out their remaining days in isolation from family, friends, and the broader community. The psychological torment of leprosy often proved as devastating as its physical symptoms. Imagine the anguish of a medieval craftsman, perhaps a skilled blacksmith or weaver, watching helplessly as his fingers became increasingly numb and clumsy, knowing that his livelihood would soon be lost forever. Picture a young mother discovering the telltale patches on her skin, realizing she would never again hold her children or share a meal with her husband. The disease stripped away not just physical capability, but human dignity itself, reducing vibrant individuals to objects of fear and disgust. Medieval medicine's understanding of leprosy was hopelessly muddled with religious doctrine and folk superstition. Physicians prescribed bizarre treatments, ranging from viper's blood to unicorn horn, while priests insisted on spiritual remedies like pilgrimage and penance. The wealthy might afford slightly better care in private facilities. But for the common people, a diagnosis of leprosy meant immediate and irreversible social death. Families would hold funeral services for living relatives, legally declaring them dead to inherit their property and sever all ties. The stigma surrounding leprosy was so profound that it gave rise to elaborate rituals of exclusion. In some regions, suspected lepers were subjected to formal trials, where their fate hung in the balance as community leaders examined their symptoms. Those found guilty faced immediate banishment, forced to surrender all worldly possessions and don the distinctive garb of the outcast. They were forbidden from entering churches, markets, or any public gathering, condemned to survive on charity thrown from a safe distance, or whatever meager sustenance they could scavenge. Yet within these communities of the condemned, remarkable bonds of solidarity often formed leper colonies, developed their own social structures, systems of governance, and even forms of commerce. Some became skilled craftsmen, despite their physical limitations, creating beautiful works of art and literature that challenged society's assumptions about their worthlessness. The irony was bitter, but profound in losing their place in medieval society. Lepers sometimes found a humanity that the outside world had forgotten. The fear of leprosy was so pervasive that it spawned countless myths and misconceptions. People believed the disease could be transmitted through breath, touch, or even prolonged eye contact. Sexual contact with lepers was thought to guarantee infection, leading to horrific punishments for those discovered in such relationships. These beliefs, while medically unfounded, shaped social policies and personal behaviors for centuries, creating a climate of paranoia that extended far beyond the actual threat posed by the disease. Alongside leprosy, Another scourge ravaged medieval populations with particular cruelty: erotism, known in its time as St. Anani's fire. This mysterious affliction struck communities seemingly at random, causing victims to experience horrifying hallucinations, convulsions, and in its most severe form, gangrene, that literally rotted limbs from the body. What medieval people could not understand was that erotism resulted from consuming grain infected with ergot fungus, a toxin that contaminated rye and other cereals. During wet growing seasons, the symptoms of erotism were so bizarre and terrifying that they seemed to confirm humanity's worst fears about divine wrath and demonic possession. Victims would suddenly begin dancing uncontrollably, their bodies racked with spasms that could last for hours or even days. Others experienced vivid hallucinations, seeing angels and demons, hearing voices from beyond, or witnessing fantastic visions that seemed more real than reality itself. The convulsive form of erotism could strike entire villages simultaneously, creating scenes of mass hysteria that defied rational explanation in the gangrenous form of the disease. Victims faced an even more horrific fate. The ergot toxins would constrict blood vessels so severely that circulation ceased entirely to extremities. Fingers, toes, hands, and feet would literally die while still attached to the body, eventually falling off in putrid blackened chunks. The pain was excruciating, often driving sufferers to madness before merciful death finally claimed them. Medieval chroniclers describe scenes of unimaginable horror, with entire families losing limbs while praying desperately for divine intervention. The religious implications of ergotism were profound and far-reaching. Many outbreaks were interpreted as signs of the apocalypse or evidence of widespread sin, requiring community-wide penance. The Order of St. Anthony gained particular prominence by claiming special powers to heal the afflicted, establishing hospitals and pilgrimage sites that drew desperate sufferers from across Europe. These institutions, while providing some comfort to victims, also profited enormously from the fear and superstition surrounding the disease. The social disruption caused by erotism epidemics could be catastrophic for medieval communities, when significant portions of the population were simultaneously afflicted with convulsions and hallucinations. Normal social and economic functions ground to a halt, fields went unharvested, crafts were abandoned, and governance collapsed as leaders either fell victim themselves or fled in terror. The random nature of ergotism outbreaks striking one village while sparing its neighbor reinforced beliefs about divine judgment and the arbitrary nature of fate. Perhaps most tragically, erotism often struck the poorest members of society with disproportionate severity. Wealthy households could afford to import grain from distant regions or store their harvests in conditions that minimized fungal contamination. The poor, however, had little choice but to consume whatever bread they could obtain, often from the very grain that harbored the deadly ergot fungus. This pattern of differential impact reinforced existing social hierarchies, while adding another layer of suffering to lives already marked by hardship and deprivation. The psychological impact of witnessing erotism outbreaks cannot be overstated. Imagine a medieval peasant watching his neighbor suddenly begin convulsing violently before his very eyes, screaming about visions of hell and damnation. Picture a mother helplessly observing as her child's fingers blackened and fell away piece by piece, despite her desperate prayers and offerings to every saint she could name. These experiences traumatized entire communities, creating collective memories of horror that persisted for generations. Medieval attempts to treat ergotism were uniformly futile and often counterproductive. Physicians prescribed bloodletting to remove corrupted humors, while priests performed exorcisms to cast out supposed demons. Hot baths were thought to draw out toxins, but actually worsened circulation problems and accelerated gangrene. Pilgrimage to holy sites was considered the most effective remedy, leading to massive movements of sick and dying people who spread panic wherever they traveled. The ineffectiveness of these treatments only deepened the sense of helplessness and divine abandonment that characterized the medieval response to epidemic disease. The economic consequences of erotism outbreaks rippled through medieval society in complex and devastating ways. When ergot contaminated grain stores, entire regions faced not only immediate health crisis, but also long-term food shortages. Merchants hesitated to trade in affected areas, fearing both contagion and economic loss. Agricultural productivity plummeted as farmers became reluctant to plant rye, the crop most susceptible to ergot infection, but also a dietary staple for much of the population. This created a vicious cycle where attempts to avoid the disease led to malnutrition and increased vulnerability to other illnesses. The random and inexplicable nature of erotism outbreaks also contributed to the climate of fear and superstition that permeated medieval life. Unlike plague, which followed somewhat predictable patterns of transmission, erotism seemed to strike without warning or apparent cause. This unpredictability made it particularly terrifying to populations already struggling with the uncertainties of daily survival. The disease became associated with divine displeasure, leading to increased religious fervor, persecution of marginalized groups, and desperate attempts to appease an apparently angry God through extreme acts of penance and sacrifice. Yet another disease that haunted medieval populations was what we now know as tuberculosis, though it was known by many names, including consumption pathos and the wasting disease. Unlike the dramatic and sudden onset of plague or erotism, tuberculosis was a slow killer that consumed its victims gradually over months or years. This prolonged dying process created its own unique form of suffering, as families watched beloved relatives slowly fade away, their bodies becoming increasingly frail and skeletal. Despite desperate attempts at treatment and care, the symptoms of tuberculosis were both debilitating and socially stigmatizing. The characteristic persistent cough, often accompanied by blood-stained sputum, marked sufferers as diseased and potentially dangerous to others. Medieval people correctly observed that the disease seemed to spread among household members, though they attributed this to corrupted air or divine punishment, rather than bacterial transmission, the wasting away of flesh. Despite maintained appetite in early stages, seemed particularly mysterious and frightening to observers who had no understanding of the underlying pathological processes. Tuberculosis struck all levels of medieval society, but had particularly devastating effects on urban populations living in crowded, poorly ventilated conditions. Monasteries, with their communal living arrangements and shared dormitories, were especially vulnerable to tuberculosis outbreaks that could decimate entire religious communities. The disease showed no respect for holiness or devotion, striking down pious monks and nuns, alongside the most hardened sinners, challenging religious explanations that linked illness to moral failings. The prolonged nature of tuberculosis created unique social and economic burdens for medieval families. Unlike diseases that killed quickly, consumption required extended periods of care that could bankrupt households and exhaust the emotional resources of caretakers. Sufferers often remained partially functional for months or years, creating difficult decisions about work, marriage, and inheritance. Children with tuberculosis pose particularly heartbreaking dilemmas as parents face the agonizing choice between continued costly treatment and acceptance of inevitable death. Medieval treatments for tuberculosis ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful. Physicians prescribed complex regimens involving dietary restrictions, herbal preparations, and bloodletting that often weakened patients. Further, the wealthy might travel to distant locations, seeking cures, spending fortunes on treatments that provided false hope, but no real benefit. Religious remedies included pilgrimage to holy sites, veneration of specific saints, and participation in elaborate rituals designed to win divine favor and healing. The social isolation experienced by tuberculosis sufferers was less dramatic than that imposed on lepers. but equally devastating in its own way. The visible signs of the disease: the persistent cough, the gradual wasting, the bloody sputum, marked victims as diseased and potentially contagious. Many found themselves gradually excluded from social gatherings, religious services, and economic activities as community members sought to protect themselves from infection. This isolation compounded the physical suffering of the disease with profound loneliness and despair. The impact of tuberculosis on medieval artistic and intellectual life was particularly poignant. Many of the era's most creative minds fell victim to the disease, their potential contributions to human knowledge and culture cut short by the slow progression of consumption. Monasteries lost scribes and illuminators whose painstaking work preserved classical learning and created beautiful manuscripts. Craft guilds saw master artisans waste away before they could fully train the next generation, creating gaps in knowledge and skill that sometimes took decades to fill. Perhaps most tragically, tuberculosis often struck young adults in their most productive years, robbing families of breadwinners and communities of their most energetic members. The disease showed a particular affinity for pregnant women and nursing mothers, creating cascading tragedies that claimed multiple generations. Simultaneously, children orphaned by tuberculosis faced uncertain futures in a society with limited provisions for their care and education. The cumulative impact of these diseases plague: smallpox, typhoid, tuberculosis, influenza, dysentery, leprosy, and erotism created a medieval world defined by suffering, uncertainty, and early death. Yet what emerges most powerfully from studying this litany of affliction is not despair, but rather profound admiration for human resilience, despite facing diseases that modern medicine can prevent or cure. Medieval people found ways to create meaning, beauty, and community in the midst of unimaginable hardship. They developed elaborate systems of care for the sick and dying, established institutions to support orphans and widows, and created art and literature that transformed suffering into transcendence. Their responses to epidemic disease, while often medically misguided, demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and adaptability. Most importantly, they never lost their fundamental humanity or their capacity to find joy and purpose. Even in the darkest of circumstances, the diseases that ravaged medieval Europe were not merely medical phenomena, but social, economic, and cultural forces that shaped every aspect of human experience they influenced. Religious belief, artistic expression, economic development, and political structures in ways that continued to resonate long after specific epidemics had passed. Understanding these diseases and their impact provides crucial insight into how human societies respond to existential threats and how communities can maintain cohesion and purpose, even when facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. As we reflect on this catalog of medieval suffering, we are reminded of both how far medical science has advanced and how fragile human life remains. The diseases that terrorized our ancestors continue to exist in modified forms, and new threats constantly emerge to challenge human ingenuity and resilience. The medieval experience with epidemic disease offers both cautionary tales about the consequences of medical ignorance and inspiring examples of human courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. Word count: 1847. The Deadliest Diseases in Medieval History. Part 6. As dawn broke over the plague, ravaged villages of medieval Europe, survivors emerged from their homes to confront a world forever changed by the relentless march of disease. The Black Death had taken its toll, but it was merely the most infamous of countless pestilences that swept through the medieval world like harbingers of doom in the aftermath of such devastation. Communities that had once thrived now resembled ghost towns, their streets littered with the remnants of lives cut tragically short. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of disease cannot be overstated. Medieval people developed what we might today recognize as collective trauma, a shared understanding that death could arrive without warning, regardless of age, social status, or perceived virtue. This ever-present specter of mortality fundamentally shaped how medieval societies functioned, from their religious practices to their economic systems, from their social hierarchies to their most intimate family relationships. Consider the profound changes that occurred in medieval art and literature following major disease outbreaks. The dance macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a ghastly dance toward the grave. These images served as both artistic expression and social commentary, reminding viewers that death was the great equalizer, claiming peasant and pope alike. The popularity of such themes reveals how deeply disease had penetrated the medieval consciousness, becoming not just a medical reality, but a cultural touchstone. Religious institutions, which had long provided comfort and explanation for life's mysteries, found themselves grappling with unprecedented challenges. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? Why did the faithful perish alongside the sinful? These questions led to significant theological debates, and in some cases, to the emergence of new religious movements. Some groups embraced extreme forms of penance, believing that collective suffering might appease divine wrath. Others turned to mysticism, seeking direct spiritual experiences that might provide answers where traditional doctrine had failed. The Fleelant movements that arose during the Black Death exemplify this religious upheaval. These groups of penitents would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in elaborate rituals designed to atone for humanity's sins. They believed that their suffering might intercede with God to end the plague, and for a time they attracted massive followings. However, their radical practices and claims to spiritual authority eventually brought them into conflict with established church hierarchy, leading to their suppression. Economic systems, too, underwent dramatic transformations in response to disease outbreaks. The massive population losses caused by plague created labor shortages that fundamentally altered the relationship between workers and employers. Surviving peasants found themselves in the unprecedented position of being able to demand higher wages and better working conditions. This shift in economic power challenged the rigid feudal system that had dominated European society for centuries. The Statute of Laborers, enacted in England in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from seeking better employment elsewhere. Similar legislation appeared across Europe as authorities struggled to maintain the old order in the face of demographic catastrophe. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful, as the simple reality of supply and demand meant that labor had become more valuable. The resulting social tensions would eventually contribute to major upheavals, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Urban areas experienced particularly dramatic changes in the wake of disease outbreaks. Cities that had grown rapidly during the medieval period suddenly found themselves depopulated, with entire neighborhoods. Abandoned property values plummeted, and guilds struggled to maintain their membership and traditional practices. Some cities never fully recovered from major plague outbreaks, while others eventually rebuilt with different populations and altered social structures. The medical profession itself was transformed by the recurring experience of epidemic disease. While medieval physicians had limited understanding of disease transmission and few effective treatments, the repeated confrontation with mass mortality forced them to develop new approaches to public health. Quarantine measures, though imperfectly understood and inconsistently applied, represented early attempts at disease control that would eventually evolve into more sophisticated public health practices. The concept of contagion, while not fully understood in terms of modern germ theory, began to influence medical thinking, and public policy authorities increasingly recognized that diseases could spread from person to person, leading to the implementation of isolation measures and travel restrictions during outbreaks. These early public health interventions, crude though they were, represented important steps toward the development of epidemiological thinking. Family structures and social relationships were profoundly affected by the constant threat of disease. Marriage patterns changed, as people sought to maximize their chances of survival and economic security. Inheritance laws were frequently modified to account for the reality that entire family lines might be wiped out within a single generation. The practice of appointing multiple heirs and creating complex succession plans became common as people attempted to ensure the continuation of their family legacy. Despite the unpredictable nature of epidemic disease, children, who were particularly vulnerable to many medieval diseases, occupied a complex position in this environment. While infant and child mortality rates were tragically high, survivors often found themselves inheriting property and responsibilities at unusually young ages. This created a generation of young adults who had witnessed extraordinary suffering, but also possessed resources and opportunities that might not have been available under normal circumstances. The constant presence of disease also influenced medieval concepts of time and planning. While we might take for granted the ability to make long-term plans and investments, medieval people lived with the understanding that any such plans might be disrupted by the sudden onset of epidemic disease. This uncertainty contributed to a culture that emphasized immediate gratification in some respects, while also fostering deep spiritual contemplation about the meaning and purpose of life. Trade and commerce were repeatedly disrupted by disease outbreaks, as merchants found their routes blocked by quarantine measures and their markets devastated by population losses. However, these disruptions also created opportunities for innovation and adaptation. New trade routes were established, new products were developed to meet changed circumstances, and new financial instruments were created to manage the increased risks associated with commercial ventures. The intellectual life of medieval Europe was similarly affected by the recurring experience of epidemic disease. Universities, which had been growing in number and influence throughout the medieval period, found their student populations and faculty decimated by plague outbreaks. However, those institutions that survived often emerged stronger, as the concentration of surviving scholars led to intensified intellectual exchange and innovation. Medical education, in particular, was transformed by the practical experience of treating epidemic diseases, while formal medical theory remained rooted in classical texts and humoral theory. Practicing physicians were forced to confront the limitations of traditional approaches. This tension between theory and practice would eventually contribute to the development of more empirical approaches to medicine. The legal systems of medieval Europe were also forced to adapt to the realities of epidemic disease. Courts had to develop procedures for handling the massive number of inheritance disputes that arose when entire families perished within short periods. New laws were created to address the problems of abandoned property and disrupted contracts. The very concept of legal continuity was challenged when entire communities might be wiped out, taking with them the local knowledge and customs that had governed legal practice. Women's roles in medieval society were particularly affected by epidemic diseases, both negatively and positively. On one hand, the high mortality rates among women of childbearing age, combined with the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth, in an era of limited medical knowledge, created enormous pressures on female survival and reproduction. On the other hand, the labor shortages created by plague outbreaks sometimes opened new economic opportunities for women, allowing them to take on roles that had previously been restricted to men. The rise of beguines and other semi-religious communities of women during the later medieval period can be partially understood as a response to the social disruptions caused by epidemic disease. These communities provided both spiritual fulfillment and economic security for women who might otherwise have struggled to survive in a world where traditional family structures had been disrupted by high mortality rates. Technological innovation was both hindered and spurred by the experience of epidemic disease, while the immediate disruption of craft traditions and apprenticeship systems slowed some forms of technological development. The labor shortages created by plague outbreaks also encouraged the development of labor-saving devices and techniques The increased use of water and wind power during the later medieval period can be partially attributed to the need to accomplish necessary work. With fewer available workers, military practices and warfare were fundamentally altered by the recurring experience of epidemic disease. Armies became vectors for disease transmission, and military campaigns were frequently disrupted or abandoned. Due to outbreaks among troops, the development of new forms of siege warfare was influenced by the understanding that disease could be as effective as conventional weapons in reducing enemy strongholds. The psychological impact of living under constant threat extended beyond individual trauma to influence collective decision-making and social institutions. Medieval communities developed elaborate rituals and practices designed to provide some sense of control over forces that were largely beyond their understanding. These ranged from religious processions and public prayers to more secular practices, such as the establishment of hospitals and charitable institutions. The medieval hospital, while rudimentary by modern standards, represented an important institutional response to the challenge of epidemic disease. These institutions served not only as places of treatment, but also as centers for community organization and mutual support. During times of crisis, the development of hospital networks across medieval Europe can be understood as an early form of public health infrastructure designed to provide care for the sick and dying, while also serving broader social functions. The experience of recurring epidemic disease also influenced medieval concepts of governance and political authority. Rulers who could effectively respond to health crises gained legitimacy and popular support, while those who appeared helpless in the face of disease outbreaks often faced challenges to their authority. This created incentives for political leaders to develop more sophisticated approaches to crisis management and public administration. The long-term demographic effects of medieval epidemic diseases extended far beyond the immediate mortality. They caused repeated population bottlenecks, led to genetic changes in European populations. As certain traits that conferred disease resistance became more common, these evolutionary pressures would have lasting effects on European populations and their descendants around the world. As we reflect on this dark chapter of human history, we must recognize that the medieval experience with epidemic disease was not simply a story of suffering and death, but also one of remarkable human resilience and adaptation. Communities that faced near extinction managed to rebuild and even thrive. Individuals who witnessed unimaginable loss found ways to create meaning and purpose in their lives. Institutions that seemed on the verge of collapse evolved and emerged stronger. The legacy of medieval epidemic diseases extends far beyond the historical period in which they occurred. The public health measures, medical practices, and social institutions that developed in response to these challenges provided the foundation for many society. The hard-won knowledge about disease prevention and treatment, accumulated through centuries of trial and error, contributed to the eventual development of modern medicine and epidemiology. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience with epidemic disease reminds us of both human vulnerability and human strength in an age when we face our own global health challenges. We can draw inspiration from the example of medieval communities that faced seemingly insurmountable odds and found ways not merely to survive, but to create something better from the ashes of destruction. Their story is ultimately one of hope triumphing over despair, of community solidarity overcoming individual fear, and of human ingenuity finding solutions to even the most intractable problems. The deadliest diseases of medieval history were indeed terrible in their scope and impact, but they were not the end of the story. They were instead crucible experiences that tested human resilience and ultimately contributed to the development of more robust, adaptable, and compassionate societies. In learning from their struggles, we honor their memory and better prepare ourselves for the challenges that lie ahead. Looking at your previous script content and the reference materials, I'll continue the script from where we left off, all focusing on the devastating diseases that plagued medieval Europe. Here's part 7, But as we've seen, the physical hardships of medieval life were compounded by an enemy far more terrifying than any earthly lord or foreign invader. Disease stalked the medieval world like a relentless predator, claiming victims with ruthless efficiency and reshaping entire civilizations in its wake. Among these microscopic killers, none were more feared or more devastating than the sweeping sickness, a mysterious ailment that would periodically descend upon communities like a biblical plague, leaving death and despair in its path. The sweating sickness first appeared in England in 1485, arriving with such sudden and terrifying force that it seemed to emerge from the very depths of hell itself, unlike the Black Death, which announced itself with telltale boos and gave its victims days or weeks to prepare for their fate. The sweating sickness struck with lightning speed. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy in the morning and be dead before the sun set. That same day, the symptoms were as mysterious as they were. Deadly victims would suddenly be seized by violent chills, followed by an overwhelming fever that caused them to sweat profusely. Their skin would burn to the touch, yet they would shiver uncontrollably. A crushing headache would split their skull like an axe, while their heart raced as if trying to escape their chest within hours. Many would fall into a stupor, their breathing becoming shallow and labored until it simply stopped altogether. What made the sweating sickness particularly terrifying was its apparent preference for the wealthy and powerful, while plague and other diseases typically ravaged the poor first. This mysterious killer seemed to delight in claiming nobles, merchants, and clergy. It was as if death itself had developed a taste for fine living and sought out those who dwelt in comfortable chambers rather than drafty hovels. The court of Henry VIII lived in constant terror. During the outbreaks, nobles would flee London at the first whisper of the disease, abandoning their estates and retreating to remote castles in the countryside. But the sweating sickness seemed to follow them wherever they went, appearing in manor houses and monasteries with equal ferocity. Some believed it was divine punishment for the sins of the wealthy, while others whispered that it was carried on the wind itself, making no place truly safe. Arthur Tudor, the eldest son of Henry VIII and heir to the English throne, fell victim to the sweating sickness in 1502. The young prince had recently married Catherine of Aragon in a union designed to strengthen ties between England and Spain, but within months of his wedding, Arthur was struck down by the mysterious disease at Lull Castle. Despite having access to the finest physicians in the realm, he died within days, leaving his younger brother Henry to inherit the throne that would make him Henry VIII. The physicians of the time were utterly baffled by the sweating sickness. Their traditional remedies of bloodletting, purging, and herbal concoctions proved useless against this swift killer. Some doctors theorized that it was caused by corrupted air. Others blamed an excess of hot humors in the blood. A few even suggested that it was spread by looking into the eyes of an infected person, leading people to avoid eye contact entirely during outbreaks. One of the most chilling aspects of the sweating sickness was how it seemed to target the young and healthy, while other diseases typically claimed the very old, the very young, or those already weakened by other ailments. This mysterious killer preferred victims in the prime of life. Strong men who could wield a sword all day would be reduced to shivering sweating. Wrecks within hours. Beautiful young women who had danced at court the night before would be found dead in their beds by morning. The social disruption caused by the sweating sickness was immense during outbreaks. Entire cities would empty as people fled to the countryside markets, closed courts, suspended their sessions, and even churches locked their doors. The disease seemed to spread wherever people gathered, making normal social and economic life impossible. Trade ground to a halt as merchants refused to enter infected areas, and food shortages became common as farmers abandoned their fields. Thomas More, the great humanist and future saint, described the terror of living through a sweating sickness outbreak in vivid detail. He wrote of how neighbors would cross the street to avoid each other, how families would barricade themselves in their homes for weeks at a time, and how the sound of church bells tolling for the dead became so constant that authorities ordered them silenced to prevent panic. The disease struck England 5 more times over the next 70 years, each outbreak claiming thousands of lives and sending shockwaves through society. The final outbreak occurred in 1551, after which the sweating sickness mysteriously vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, never to return to this day. Historians and medical experts debate what the sweating sickness actually was, with theories ranging from an early form of influenza to a unique viral infection that somehow burned itself out. But the sweating sickness was just one of many mysterious killers that haunted medieval Europe. Dancing mania, also known as St. Vitus's dance, was another bizarre affliction that would periodically seize entire communities. Victims would begin dancing uncontrollably, sometimes for days or even weeks, until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some died from heart failure or stroke brought on by the relentless movement, while others sustained serious injuries from their frenzied gyrations. The first recorded outbreak of dancing mania occurred in Aachen in 1374, where hundreds of people suddenly began dancing in the streets. The affliction spread rapidly to other cities along the Rhine, creating a bizarre spectacle of mass hysteria. Witnesses described how the dancers would leap and spin with wild abandon, their faces contorted in expressions of both ecstasy and agony. They seemed unable to stop themselves, as if possessed by some demonic force that compelled them to dance until their bodies gave out. The most famous outbreak occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when a woman named Frau Tropfa began dancing alone in the street. Within a week, dozens of others had joined her, and within a month, the number of dancers had swollen to around 400. The local authorities, believing that the afflicted could only be cured by more dancing, hired musicians and built a stage to encourage the frenzied movement. This decision proved disastrous, as the epidemic only grew worse, with reports of people dying from heart attacks, strokes, and sheer exhaustion. Medieval physicians were as baffled by dancing mania as they were by the sweating sickness. Some blamed it on hot blood, others on supernatural possession. The Church declared it a punishment for sin and prescribed prayer and pilgrimage as cures. Some communities tried to break the spell by playing different types of music, believing that certain melodies could counteract whatever force was compelling the dancers. Others resorted to physical restraint, tying down the afflicted until the urge to dance passed. Modern medical experts believe that dancing mania was likely a form of mass psychogenic illness brought on by the extreme stress and hardship of medieval life. The constant threat of disease, famine, and war created a powder keg of psychological tension that occasionally exploded into these bizarre episodes of collective behavior. The dancing may have served as a form of release, allowing people to express their fears and frustrations in a socially acceptable 34 way, even if that expression took a dangerous and ultimately destructive form. Another mysterious affliction that plagued medieval Europe was the English sweats, a different disease entirely from the sweating sickness. Despite the similar name, this illness was characterized by severe joint pain, fever, and a distinctive rash that would spread across the victim's body like wildfire. Unlike many medieval diseases, the English sweat seemed to affect all social classes, equally striking down peasants and nobles with equal ferocity. The most terrifying aspect of the English sweats was how it could transform healthy individuals into twisted, pain-racked shadows of their former selves. Victims would develop severe arthritis-like symptoms, their joints swelling to grotesque proportions and becoming so painful that even the slightest movement was agony. The rash that accompanied the disease was said to be so intense that it felt like being burned alive from the inside out. King Henry VI himself was struck down by what many historians believe was the English sweats in 1453. The young king, who had been governing England with reasonable success, despite his youth, suddenly fell into a catatonic state that lasted for over a year. During this time, he was completely unresponsive, unable to speak, move, or even recognize his own wife and infant son. The illness effectively ended his active reign and contributed to the political instability that would eventually erupt into the Wars of the Roses. These mysterious diseases were made all the more terrifying by medieval medicine's complete inability to understand or treat them. Physicians of the time operated under the theory of the four humors, believing that all illness was caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile in the body. Their treatments typically involved bloodletting, purging, and the administration of various herbal concoctions, none of which had any real effect on these bizarre afflictions. The helplessness of medieval medicine in the face of these diseases cannot be overstated when the sweating sickness struck. Even the most learned physicians could do nothing but watch their patients die. When dancing mania seized a community, doctors were reduced to wild speculation about supernatural causes. When the English sweats transformed a healthy young king into a mindless shell, the royal physicians could only stand by in bewildered horror. This medical helplessness had profound psychological effects on medieval society. People lived in constant fear of these mysterious killers, never knowing when they might strike next or whom they might claim. The unpredictable nature of these diseases made them seem almost supernatural, as if they were weapons wielded by angry gods or malevolent spirits, rather than natural phenomena that could be understood and treated. The impact of these mysterious diseases extended far beyond their immediate victims. Families were torn apart as healthy relatives fled from infected loved ones. Communities were paralyzed by fear and superstition. Economic life ground to a halt during outbreaks as people refused to leave their homes or conduct business with outsiders. The very fabric of medieval society was repeatedly torn and rewoven by these invisible killers. Religious authorities struggled to provide explanations for these inexplicable afflictions. Some clergy declared them to be punishments for collective sin, while others saw them as tests of faith sent by a loving but stern God. Pilgrimages to holy sites increased dramatically during outbreaks. As people desperately sought divine intervention, special masses were held, relics were paraded through the streets, and prayers were offered continuously in hopes of appeasing whatever divine wrath had been unleashed. The psychological trauma inflicted by these diseases was perhaps as devastating as their physical effects. Survivors often struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of watching loved ones die in agony while being powerless to help. Communities that had been struck by these mysterious afflictions often developed elaborate rituals and superstitions designed to prevent their return, even though no one truly understood what had caused them in the first place. Perhaps most tragically, these mysterious diseases often struck just as communities were beginning to recover from other disasters. A village that had survived a plague outbreak would be devastated by dancing mania. A noble family that had weathered political upheaval might be wiped out by the sweating sickness. The cumulative effect was to keep medieval society in a state of constant vulnerability, never allowing people to feel truly secure or safe. The legacy of these mysterious diseases extended far beyond the medieval period. The memory of the sweating sickness lingered in English consciousness for centuries, influencing how people thought about disease and contagion. The fear of sudden, inexplicable illness shaped medical practice and public health policy well into the modern era. Even today, when new diseases emerge, there are echoes of the terror that medieval people felt when confronted with these incomprehensible killers. As we reflect on these mysterious medieval diseases, we are reminded of how fragile human life truly is, and how much we owe to the advances in medical science that protect us today. The physicians who struggled helplessly against the sweating sickness and dancing mania were not incompetent or ignorant. They were simply operating with the limited knowledge and tools available to them. Their dedication to their patients, even in the face of diseases they could not understand or treat, represents one of the more admirable aspects of medieval medicine. Yet these mysterious killers also reveal something profound about the human spirit. Despite living under the constant threat of inexplicable death, medieval people continued to build, create, love, and hope. They married and had children. Knowing those children might be claimed by forces beyond their understanding, they invested in the future. Even when the present seemed so uncertain in their courage to continue living fully in the face of such uncertainty, we find inspiration for our own struggles against the unknown. Challenges that await us. The story of these mysterious medieval diseases is ultimately a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience. They remind us that for all our modern medical advances, we are still engaged in an ongoing battle against forces that seek to cut short our time on this earth. But they also show us that even in the darkest of times, when death stalks the land like a hungry wolf, the human spirit refuses to be completely extinguished. In that refusal, in that stubborn determination to keep living and loving. Despite everything we find, one of the most beautiful and inspiring aspects of our shared human story. Here's part 8 of the deadliest diseases in medieval history script. As dawn broke over the medieval world, another scourge began to manifest itself across the landscape, one that would prove just as devastating as any. Plague or pestilence. While the Black Death had ravaged bodies with its bubonic fury, this new enemy attacked the very foundations of society itself through a different kind of contagion. The disease of social division and the pestilence of power had begun to spread through every level of medieval civilization, creating wounds that would fester for generations to come. The rigid caste system that governed medieval life had become a breeding ground for its own particular strain of suffering. Like a virulent pathogen, inequality spread through communities, infecting relationships between lord and serf clergy, and laity, rich and poor. This social sickness manifested in ways that were often more cruel than any physical malady. While a fever might claim a life in days, the disease of subjugation could torture souls for entire lifetimes. Consider the plight of a typical serf family bound to their lord's land, as surely as if they had been chained there. Unlike the swift devastation of plague, their suffering was a slow grinding affliction that passed from parent to child like a hereditary curse. They could not flee their circumstances as one might flee a plague-ridden city. Their very existence was defined by a social pathology that deemed them less than human, mere tools to be used and discarded at their master's whim. The symptoms of this social disease were everywhere to be seen. Malnutrition ravaged the peasant classes, not because food was unavailable, but because the fruits of their own labor were systematically extracted by their betters. Children grew stunted, not from lack of care, but from a system that viewed their potential as property to be exploited. Women suffered under multiple layers of oppression, their bodies and lives controlled by fathers, husbands, and lords. In an endless hierarchy of domination, this social contagion proved remarkably resistant to treatment, unlike physical diseases that might burn themselves out or succumb to crude medieval remedies. The illness of inequality seemed to strengthen with each passing generation. The very institutions that might have provided cure, the church, the law, the nobility itself, had become infected carriers of the disease, spreading it, even as they claimed to offer salvation. The church, despite its teachings of universal brotherhood and divine love, had become perhaps the most virulent spreader of social pestilence. Priests preached that poverty was a blessing, while they themselves lived in luxury. They taught that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next, effectively inoculating the oppressed against any desire to seek justice in their current lives. The ecclesiastical hierarchy mirrored and reinforced the secular order, creating a double infection that proved nearly impossible to cure. Yet perhaps nowhere was this social pathology more evident than in the treatment of those already afflicted by physical disease. Lepers cast out from society and forced to announce their presence with bells and clappers suffered not just from their physical condition, but from a social death that preceded their biological one. They became living symbols of how medieval society treated those it deemed unworthy, creating a template for exclusion that would be applied to countless other groups deemed dangerous or undesirable. The mentally ill faced similar social death sentences, viewed as possessed by demons or cursed by God, they were often chained, beaten, or simply abandoned to die. Their conditions, which we now understand as treatable illnesses, were interpreted through the lens of a society that saw suffering as either divine punishment or demonic influence. The social disease of superstition compounded their physical and mental anguish, creating layers of torment that no medieval remedy could touch. Women who dared to practice healing arts faced accusations of witchcraft, their knowledge and compassion twisted into evidence of supernatural malevolence. The social contagion of misogyny infected even the pursuit of medical knowledge, ensuring that half the population's wisdom and insight would be systematically suppressed and often violently eliminated. Thousands of women who might have advanced medical understanding instead found themselves burning at stakes, their expertise consumed by the flames of ignorance and fear. The disease of violence had become endemic to medieval society, spreading through every social interaction like a fever that never broke. Lords settled disputes through warfare that devastated the countryside and slaughtered the innocent knights supposedly bound by codes of chivalry, routinely engaged in rape, pillage, and murder. Violence was not seen as a symptom to be cured, but as a natural state of affairs, even a virtue when directed against the right targets. This normalization of brutality created its own pathological cycle. Children raised in violent households became violent adults. Communities that survived through raiding and warfare could not easily transition to peaceful coexistence. The very skills that kept one alive in medieval society, the ability to fight, to dominate, to take what one needed by force, became impediments to creating a healthier social order. Economic systems had developed their own disease characteristics, creating artificial scarcities that enriched the few while impoverishing the many. The concentration of land ownership in the hands of a tiny elite meant that vast populations lived perpetually on the edge of starvation, not because the earth could not support them, but because human greed had infected the distribution of resources. This economic pathology proved remarkably persistent, creating famines in times of plenty and ensuring that even good harvests brought little relief to those who worked the fields. Trade networks, while bringing new goods and ideas, also served as vectors for social diseases. The pursuit of profit often trumped human welfare, leading to the exploitation of distant populations, and the spread of slavery and indentured servitude. Merchants might bring spices and silks from foreign lands, but they also brought new forms of exploitation and new justifications for treating certain groups as less than human. The legal systems of medieval Europe had themselves become infected with the diseases. They were meant to cure. Justice was not blind, but rather selectively sighted, seeing clearly when the poor transgressed, but growing mysteriously dim when the wealthy and powerful committed crimes. Courts that should have protected the innocent instead became instruments of oppression, legitimizing theft, murder, and exploitation when committed by those with sufficient social standing. Trial by ordeal and trial by combat represented the complete surrender of justice to superstition and violence rather than seeking truth through investigation and evidence. Medieval legal systems often relied on divine intervention or brute force to determine guilt or innocence. This judicial pathology ensured that outcomes reflected power dynamics rather than actual justice, perpetuating the very inequalities that generated crime and conflict. In the first place, the educational systems, such as they were, had been thoroughly infected with social disease. Literacy was hoarded by the elite, like a precious medicine kept from the masses who might use knowledge to question their circumstances. The church controlled most learning, ensuring that education served to reinforce existing power structures rather than challenge them. Libraries were locked away in monasteries, their contents available only to those who had already sworn allegiance to the established order. This deliberate cultivation of ignorance among the general population served as a form of intellectual epidemic, keeping people in darkness about alternatives to their current suffering. Folk knowledge and traditional wisdom were systematically suppressed or demonized, leaving communities vulnerable to both physical and social diseases that might have been prevented or cured through broader access to information and learning. The very concept of childhood had been infected with adult pathologies. Children were viewed as miniature adults, expected to work and fight and suffer without the protection that their developmental needs required. Child mortality was accepted with a resignation that bordered on the pathological, as if the deaths of the young were simply part of the natural order, rather than a preventable tragedy. Young girls were married off to older men in arrangements that would be recognized today as systematic abuse. Boys were trained for violence from an early age. Their natural compassion and creativity suppressed in favor of martial skills and aggressive dominance. The innocence and potential of childhood was sacrificed to perpetuate social systems that served adult interests while devastating young lives. Perhaps most insidiously, the social diseases of medieval society had developed a kind of psychological immunity that made them resistant to reform. People had become so accustomed to suffering and inequality that they often defended the very systems that oppressed them. Serfs would sometimes fight to protect the lords who exploited them. Women would enforce the restrictions that limited their own freedom. The oppressed had internalized their oppression so thoroughly that they became willing participants in their own subjugation. This psychological dimension of social disease proved particularly difficult to treat because it operated below the level of conscious awareness. People did not recognize their conditions as pathological because they had never known health. They mistook chronic social illness for the natural state of human existence, making them resistant to treatments that might have offered genuine healing and liberation. Religious authorities exploited this psychological vulnerability by teaching that earthly suffering was not only inevitable, but spiritually beneficial. They created elaborate theological justifications for inequality and oppression, convincing their flocks that resistance to injustice was actually resistance to God's will. This spiritual infection proved particularly virulent because it attacked people's deepest hopes and fears, turning their faith into an instrument of their own oppression. The merchant classes, emerging as a new social force during the later medieval period, brought their own pathologies to an already diseased society. Their pursuit of profit often came at the expense of traditional community bonds and mutual obligations. They introduced new forms of exploitation based on debt and contract rather than feudal obligation, creating different but equally oppressive relationships between rich and poor urban centers. Growing around commercial activity became breeding grounds for new social diseases. Overcrowding, pollution, and crime flourished in these early cities, while traditional support networks broke down under the pressure of rapid change. The anonymity of city life allowed for new forms of exploitation, while undermining the community bonds that had provided some protection for the vulnerable in rural settings. Even attempts at reform often carried the seeds of new social diseases. Crusading movements, while ostensibly religious in nature, became vehicles for violence, greed, and cultural destruction. Efforts to purify the church led to increased persecution of minorities and debtors. Programs meant to help the poor often reinforced their dependency and powerlessness. The social diseases of medieval society proved remarkably adaptable, mutating to survive new conditions and infecting even well-intentioned efforts at improvement. Like biological pathogens, they developed resistance to treatments and found new hosts when old ones became inhospitable. This adaptability ensured their persistence across centuries and their transmission to subsequent generations. Yet even in this landscape of social pathology, there were signs of health and resistance. Communities sometimes came together to protect their most vulnerable members. Individuals occasionally transcended their circumstances to create beauty, knowledge, or compassion that enriched human experience. Reform movements, however flawed, kept alive the possibility that society could be healed of its diseases. The very persistence of hope in the face of overwhelming social sickness testified to something indomitable in the human spirit. People continued to love their children, care for their neighbors, and dream of better worlds. Even when all evidence suggested that such dreams were futile, this stubborn optimism served as a kind of social antibiotic preventing the complete triumph of despair and keeping alive the possibility of eventual healing. Women, despite systematic oppression, found ways to preserve and transmit knowledge, particularly in areas of healing and midwifery. Their informal networks served as alternative channels of communication and support, creating spaces where different values and practices could survive their resilience. In the face of multiple forms of oppression, provided a model for resistance that would inspire future generations. Religious mystics and reformers working within and against established church structures kept alive visions of justice and equality that challenged prevailing orthodoxies. Their writings and teachings, often suppressed or marginalized in their own time, planted seeds that would eventually grow into more comprehensive challenges to social disease. Even the emergence of new social classes and economic arrangements, however problematic, created cracks in the rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval society. Merchants, artisans, and professionals developed their own interests and perspectives that did not always align with traditional elite values. These emerging groups would eventually provide the social base for more systematic challenges to medieval pathologies. The diseases that afflicted medieval society were not merely historical curiosities, but rather warning signs of what happens when human communities lose their way. The social pathologies of that era continue to echo in our own time, reminding us that the struggle for health and justice is never finally won, but must be renewed by each generation. The medieval experience teaches us that social diseases, like biological ones, require constant vigilance and active treatment to prevent their spread and recurrence. Understanding these historical patterns of social sickness can help us recognize similar pathologies in our own time and work more effectively to create healthier communities. The medieval world's legacy is not just one of suffering and oppression, but also of the persistent human capacity to imagine and work toward better ways of living together. In studying their diseases, we learn not only about their failures, but also about the enduring possibilities for healing and transformation that exist within human society. As the plague's shadow lifted from the medieval world, a new chapter in human understanding slowly began to unfold. The devastating losses had paradoxically created opportunities, vacant lands, labor shortages, and the gradual weakening of feudal bonds. Yet even as society rebuilt itself from the ashes of pestilence, the fundamental challenges of disease and medical ignorance remained deeply entrenched in the fabric of medieval life. Among the most feared and misunderstood afflictions of the Middle Ages was leprosy, a disease that struck terror into the hearts of all who encountered it. Unlike the swift devastation of plague, leprosy was a slow creeping horror that transformed its victims into living outcasts, banished from society and condemned to exist on its very margins. The disease, now known as Hansen's disease, was poorly understood by medieval physicians, who attributed it to everything from divine punishment for sin to corrupted humors and poisonous air. The first signs of leprosy were often subtle: a patch of discolored skin, a loss of sensation in the fingers or toes, or small nodules appearing on the face. But as the disease progressed, its effects became increasingly horrific and unmistakable. The bacteria that caused leprosy attacked the peripheral nerves, leading to loss of feeling in the extremities without sensation. Victims would unknowingly injure themselves, leading to infections, gangrene, and the gradual loss of fingers, toes, and even entire limbs. The face too bore the terrible marks of the disease. The nose would collapse as cartilage was destroyed, creating the characteristic leonine appearance that medieval people found so frightening. Eyebrows would disappear, and the skin would become thick and nodular. Most tragically, many sufferers would lose their sight as the disease affected the delicate tissues of the eyes. Medieval society's response to leprosy was swift and merciless. Those suspected of having the disease were subjected to examination by local authorities, often including clergy, who were considered experts in identifying the telltale signs. If diagnosed with leprosy, the victim faced a fate that was in many ways worse than death. They were declared legally dead. Their property was seized, and they were expelled from all human community. The ritual of separation was formalized in a ceremony that resembled a funeral. The leper would be brought to the church, where a priest would read the burial service over them. While they stood in their own grave, earth would be thrown upon their feet, symbolizing their death to the world. They were then given a wooden clapper or bell to warn others of their approach, dressed in a distinctive hooded robe, and sent forth to live as best they could in the wilderness, beyond the town walls. For these unfortunate souls, survival depended on charity and their own resourcefulness. Some found refuge in leprosaria hospitals, specifically established for lepers, where they could live together in communities of the afflicted. These institutions, often founded by religious orders or wealthy benefactors seeking to perform acts of Christian charity, provided basic shelter and sustenance. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, founded in 1123, was one such institution that cared for lepers for centuries. Life in a leprosarium was governed by strict rules designed to prevent the spread of disease and maintain order among the residents. Lepers were forbidden from leaving the grounds without permission, could not marry unless both parties were already afflicted, and were required to attend daily religious services. They supported themselves through begging simple crafts and whatever charity they could obtain from the outside world. Yet even within these walls, the progression of the disease continued relentlessly. Medieval medicine had no effective treatments for leprosy. Though physicians and folk healers attempted various remedies, some prescribed bloodletting to balance the humors, while others recommended potions made from exotic ingredients, like viper's flesh or powdered unicorn horn. Sulfur baths were thought to cleanse the corrupted blood, and pilgrimage to holy shrines offered the hope of miraculous cure. The social impact of leprosy extended far beyond its immediate victims. The fear of contagion was so great that even those who cared for lepers were viewed with suspicion. Families would sometimes abandon relatives at the first sign of the disease, and communities would drive out anyone who showed the slightest symptoms. This terror was not entirely unfounded. Leprosy is indeed contagious, though far less so than medieval people believed, requiring prolonged close contact for transmission. The economic consequences were equally severe. When a breadwinner was diagnosed with leprosy, entire families could be plunged into destitution. The seizure of the lepers' property was intended to prevent them from infecting others, but it often left their relatives homeless and penniless. Some families would go to great lengths to conceal early symptoms, risking severe punishment if discovered. Perhaps most tragically, leprosy struck down people in the prime of their lives, unlike plague, which killed quickly, or the various childhood diseases that claimed the very young. Leprosy typically manifested in adults who had families and responsibilities. The slow progression of the disease meant that victims had to watch helplessly as their bodies deteriorated and their connections to the world were severed. One by one, the psychological trauma of leprosy was immense. Victims not only had to cope with the physical pain and disfigurement, but also with the complete loss of their social identity. They went from being valued members of their communities to pariahs who were literally considered dead to the world. Many fell into deep despair, while others found solace in religious devotion, viewing their suffering as a form of martyrdom that would ensure their salvation. Some lepers, however, managed to find purpose and even a form of dignity within their affliction. They formed tight-knit communities within leprosaria, supporting one another through shared experience. Some became renowned for their piety and wisdom with people, occasionally seeking them out for spiritual counsel. A few even achieved a kind of sainthood, their suffering transformed into a source of inspiration for others. The fear and stigma surrounding leprosy also gave rise to numerous myths and legends. Stories circulated of lepers who possessed supernatural powers or whose touch could transfer their affliction to others. Some tales spoke of leprous knights who continued to fight in the Crusades, their diseased bodies hidden beneath armor, driven by religious fervor to serve God. Despite their condition, the medieval understanding of leprosy was further complicated by the tendency to conflate it with other skin conditions. Many people diagnosed with leprosy may actually have suffered from conditions like psoriasis, vitiligo, or other dermatological disorders. This medical ignorance meant that some were unnecessarily condemned to the living death of leprosy, while others who truly had the disease might go undiagnosed if their symptoms were atypical. The Church's attitude toward leprosy was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, lepers were seen as cursed by God, afflicted for their sins or the sins of their ancestors. On the other hand, Christian teaching emphasized that caring for the sick was a holy duty, and many religious orders dedicated themselves to serving lepers. Some theologians even argued that lepers were blessed, their earthly suffering ensuring their place in heaven. This theological ambiguity was reflected in the varying treatment of lepers across different regions and time periods. In some places they were treated with relative compassion, provided with adequate shelter and care. In others, they faced brutal persecution and were driven into the wilderness to die alone. The wealth and power of local leprosaria also varied greatly, with some becoming substantial institutions, while others remained little more than hovels. The gradual decline of leprosy in Europe during the later Middle Ages remains something of a mystery to historians and medical experts. Improved nutrition, better hygiene, and the devastating impact of plague, which killed many lepers, along with the general population, all likely contributed to its reduction. The rise of tuberculosis, which may have provided some cross-immunity to leprosy, could also have played a role as leprosy retreated. The elaborate social structures built around it began to crumble. Many leprosia were abandoned or converted to other uses, their original purpose forgotten as new generations grew up without the terror of the living death. Yet the memory of leprosy left an indelible mark on medieval society, reinforcing fears about disease and contagion that would shape responses to future epidemics. The legacy of medieval leprosy extends beyond its immediate impact on those who suffered from it. The social mechanisms developed to isolate and control lepers, the medical examinations, the legal declarations of civil death, the specialized institutions would be adapted and applied to other diseases and social problems. The fear and stigma associated with leprosy also contributed to a broader culture of suspicion and exclusion that affected other marginalized groups. For the historians studying this dark chapter of medieval life, leprosy represents more than just a medical condition. It serves as a window into the fears, beliefs, and social structures of the time. The treatment of lepers reveals the tensions between Christian charity and self-preservation, between communal responsibility and individual terror. It shows how disease could not only destroy bodies, but also tear apart the very fabric of society. As we reflect on the medieval experience of leprosy, we are reminded of humanity's long struggle against disease and the social consequences of medical ignorance. The lepers of the Middle Ages, cast out from society and condemned to live as the walking dead, bore witness to both the cruelty and the compassion of their age. Their stories, though often forgotten, remain a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. Yet even as leprosy cast its long shadow over medieval society, other diseases lurked in the darkness, ready to emerge and test humanity's endurance. Once again, the medieval world was a place where illness and death were constant companions, where the line between the living and the dead was often disturbingly thin, and where the next plague was always just over the horizon, waiting to reshape the world once more. Looking at the provided reference videos and your detailed summary, I'll continue the script, focusing on how diseases shaped medieval culture, society, and daily life beyond just causing death. Here's part 10. Yet perhaps the most profound impact of these devastating diseases wasn't measured in death tolls alone, but in how they fundamentally transformed the very fabric of medieval society. The Black Death, didn't just kill bodies, it killed beliefs, traditions, and entire ways of life that had endured for centuries in the aftermath of each plague outbreak. Survivors found themselves living in a world that felt alien and uncertain. The rigid social hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as stone began to crack and crumble. When death struck randomly, claiming peasant and prince alike, it became impossible to maintain that God had ordained the nobility to rule by divine right. If the Almighty truly favored the wealthy and powerful, why did they die screaming in agony? Alongside the lowliest serf, this crisis of faith rippled through every level of society. In monasteries across Europe, monks who had devoted their lives to serving God watched helplessly as their brothers died, despite endless prayers and penance. Some began to question whether their devotion meant anything at all. Others doubled down on extreme religious practices, flagellating themselves bloody in desperate attempts to appease what they believed was divine wrath. The economic disruption was equally dramatic. Entire guilds of craftsmen vanished overnight, taking their specialized knowledge to the grave. Trade routes that had functioned for generations collapsed when the merchants who maintained them succumbed to disease. Fields lay, not because of drought or war, but because there was simply no one left alive to work them. In this chaos, opportunity emerged for those clever or fortunate enough to survive. Peasants who had never dared dream of owning land suddenly found themselves inheriting estates from deceased relatives. Servants became masters of households when their employers died. Women, traditionally barred from most trades, stepped into roles left vacant by their dead husbands, and fathers becoming blacksmiths, brewers, and even physicians. The psychological trauma of living through repeated plague outbreaks created a culture obsessed with death, and the afterlife. Medieval art became increasingly macabre, filled with images of dancing skeletons and rotting corpses. The memento mori, remember, you must die, became a common theme in everything from jewelry to church murals. People carried these reminders not out of morbid fascination, but as psychological armor against the constant threat of sudden death. This preoccupation with mortality also fueled an almost frenzied pursuit of earthly pleasures. If death could come at any moment, why not feast, drink, and make merry while you still could? The period following major plague outbreaks often saw an explosion of festivals, elaborate feasts, and public celebrations. It was as if entire communities were desperately trying to prove they were still alive. The demographic collapse caused by disease created labor shortages that fundamentally altered the relationship between workers and their employers. Suddenly, surviving peasants found themselves in the unprecedented position of being able to demand higher wages and better working conditions. Lords who had once treated their serfs as barely human property now competed desperately for their services, offering freedoms and privileges that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. This shift in power dynamics terrified the established authorities. Laws were hastily passed, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from moving between employers, but these measures were largely ineffective. You can't legislate away economic reality. The result was a series of peasant uprisings across Europe as workers fought to maintain their newfound leverage. The intellectual impact of these diseases was equally profound. The failure of traditional medicine to provide any effective treatment led to a crisis of confidence in established authorities. If learned physicians, with their ancient Greek texts and complex theories about bodily humors, couldn't save anyone, what good was all that accumulated wisdom? This skepticism helped fuel the early stirrings of what would eventually become the scientific revolution. Universities began to emphasize direct observation over classical authority. Physicians started performing autopsies to understand disease despite religious prohibitions against defiling corpses. The very foundations of medieval scholarship, the idea that all important knowledge could be found in ancient texts, began to erode. The repeated trauma of epidemic disease also reshaped family structures and social relationships. When survival was uncertain, people formed deeper, more intense bonds with those around them. Community solidarity became a survival strategy. Neighbors who might have feuded over property boundaries instead worked together to care for orphan children and maintain essential services. Yet these same diseases could tear communities apart just as easily. Fear of contagion led to the abandonment of fundamental human obligations. Parents fled from infected children. Priests refused last rites to dying parishioners. The normal bonds of love, duty, and social responsibility dissolved under the pressure of mortal terror. Perhaps nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the treatment of marginalized groups. Jews, already subject to persecution, became convenient scapegoats for inexplicable suffering. Entire Jewish communities were massacred by mobs, convinced that poisoned wells or demonic conspiracies had caused the plague. Lepers, beggars, and foreigners faced similar persecution as people desperately sought someone to blame for their misfortune. The artistic and literary legacy of medieval disease reveals a society grappling with fundamental questions about human existence. The great allegories of the period works, like Pierce Plowman, and the morality plays are shot through with themes of corruption, redemption, and the struggle between earthly desire and spiritual salvation. These weren't abstract theological debates, but urgent practical questions for people who had watched their entire world die around them. Music, too, reflected this transformation. The elegant courtly songs of the earlier medieval period gave way to haunting dirges and frenzied dance tunes. The famous Desi Day of Wrath became one of the most recognizable melodies in Europe, its ominous notes echoing through churches and inspiring composers for centuries to come. Even the physical landscape of Europe bears the scars of medieval disease. Abandoned villages are stones slowly reclaimed by forest. The countryside ghost parishes, where churches stand empty in fields that were once bustling communities. These ruins serve as silent monuments to the demographic catastrophes that repeatedly swept across the continent. The survivors of these epidemics didn't just rebuild, they built differently. Towns constructed better drainage systems and imposed stricter sanitation regulations. Hospitals evolved from simple shelters for the dying into institutions focused on healing. The very concept of public health, of collective responsibility for preventing disease, emerged from the ashes of medieval pandemics. But perhaps the most lasting impact of medieval disease was on the European psyche itself. The experience of living through repeated apocalyptic events created a culture that was simultaneously fatalistic and resilient. People learned to expect disaster while also developing remarkable capacities for recovery and adaptation. This psychological legacy would prove crucial as Europe entered the modern era. The same societies that had survived the Black Death would go on to launch the age of exploration, drive the scientific revolution, and ultimately reshape the entire world. The mental toughness forged in the crucible of epidemic disease became a competitive advantage in an increasingly complex and dangerous world today. As we face our own global health challenges, there's something both humbling and inspiring about looking back at our medieval ancestors. They endured suffering on a scale that's difficult for us to comprehend. Yet they didn't just survive. They transformed adversity into opportunity, chaos into creativity, and despair into determination. The diseases that stalked medieval Europe were indeed deadly enemies, but they were also, in their terrible way, agents of change. They shattered old certainties and forced the creation of new institutions, new ideas, and new ways of understanding human existence and learning to live with death. Medieval people ultimately learned how to build a more resilient and adaptable civilization. As we close this chapter of our journey through medieval mallets, we carry with us the knowledge that human societies possess remarkable powers of recovery and reinvention. The same species that nearly succumbed to plague and pestilence also created art, literature, and institutions that continue to inspire us centuries later. In their struggle against invisible enemies, our ancestors discovered reserves of courage, creativity, and compassion that remind us of the very best of human nature. Their story is our story, a testament to the indomitable spirit that allows our species not just to survive catastrophe, but to emerge from it, stronger, wiser, and more humane than before. Here's part 11 of the 12-part script on the deadliest diseases in medieval history as we approach the end of our journey through medieval Europe's darkest medical chapters. We must confront perhaps the most chilling aspect of these deadly diseases, their role as harbingers of social collapse and transformation. The diseases we've examined didn't merely kill, they fundamentally rewrote the fabric of a medieval civilization itself. Consider the aftermath of the Black Death-sweating sickness and the countless other pestilences that swept across Europe. These weren't isolated medical events, but catalysts for the most profound social upheaval the continent had ever witnessed, when a third of the population vanished. In a matter of years, the very foundations of feudalism began to crumble like ancient stone. The rigid social hierarchy that had defined medieval life for centuries suddenly found itself on unstable ground. Peasants who had once been bound to the land discovered their labor was now precious scarce, and valuable lords who had commanded absolute authority over their serfs watched helplessly as their workforce disappeared into mass graves or fled to seek better opportunities elsewhere in England. The immediate aftermath of the Black Death saw wages double, even triple, in some regions. Surviving peasants could suddenly demand not just higher pay, but better food, improved living conditions, and freedoms. Their ancestors could never have imagined the Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, desperately attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. The psychological impact was equally profound. Medieval Europeans had lived their entire lives believing in a divinely ordained social order where everyone knew their place. God had supposedly arranged society with kings at the top and peasants at the bottom. And to question this arrangement was to question God himself. But when the plague struck down noble and peasant with equal ferocity, when bishops died as readily as beggars, that entire worldview began to fracture. The dance of death, or dance macabre, emerged as a powerful artistic movement during this period. These haunting depictions showed skeletons leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, merchants, farmers, in a final dance toward the grave. The message was unmistakable: death recognizes no earthly distinctions. This was revolutionary thinking for its time, suggesting that perhaps the social order wasn't as divinely sanctioned as people had been taught to believe. But the diseases did more than challenge social hierarchies. They transformed the very relationship between the living and the dead. Medieval people had always been familiar with death, but the scale of mortality during plague years created an entirely new relationship with mortality. Mass graves became commonplace. Traditional burial rites, so important to medieval Christianity, became impossible to maintain when hundreds died daily. The memento mori tradition gained unprecedented popularity during this period. Remember you must die wasn't just a philosophical reminder, but a daily reality. Skulls appeared in artwork, jewelry, and architecture. With increasing frequency, books of ours began featuring more elaborate depictions of death and judgment. The medieval mind became obsessed with preparation for death in ways that would have seemed extreme to earlier generations. This preoccupation with mortality had profound theological implications. If God was allowing such unprecedented suffering, what did that say about divine justice? Some turned to extreme religious devotion, joining flagellant movements that practiced public self-torture as penance for humanity's sins. Others began to question church authority, altogether noting that priests died just as readily as anyone else, and that their prayers seemed powerless against the plague. The economic transformations were equally dramatic. The guild system, which had dominated medieval commerce, found itself struggling to adapt to a world where traditional apprenticeship systems had been decimated. Master craftsmen, who had expected to pass their skills to sons or apprentices, found their workshops empty. Knowledge that had been carefully guarded within family lines. for generations was lost forever. Trade routes that had connected medieval Europe to the wider world became vectors of death. The very prosperity that had allowed cities to grow and flourish now seemed cursed. Venice, that great commercial power, watched its population plummet as ships brought not just exotic goods but exotic diseases. The Silk Road, once a symbol of human achievement in connecting distant civilizations, became known as a highway of death. Yet from this devastation emerged new forms of social organization. The traditional manor system, already showing signs of strain, accelerated its transformation into more modern forms of agriculture. Money increasingly replaced labor services. Peasants who had once been tied to the land by law and custom found themselves free to move to seek better opportunities to negotiate their own terms of employment. The rise of the middle class, which would eventually reshape European society, was directly accelerated by these demographic catastrophes. With traditional elites depleted and labor scarce, opportunities arose for ambitious individuals to accumulate wealth and status in ways that would have been impossible under the old system. Merchants who survived the plagues often found themselves in positions of unprecedented influence. Women's roles, too, began to shift in subtle but significant ways. When male heads of households died, women often found themselves managing businesses, properties, and estates they would never have controlled under normal circumstances. Some historians argue that the late medieval period saw a temporary expansion of women's economic roles that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. The medical profession itself underwent fundamental changes. The failure of traditional treatments and the obvious helplessness of trained physicians in the face of epidemic diseases led to a crisis of confidence in established medical authority. Folk healers, wise women, and empirical approaches to medicine gained credibility as formal medical training proved inadequate. New hospitals began to emphasize isolation and quarantine rather than just spiritual care. The concept of public health, the idea that government had a responsibility to protect the population from disease, began to emerge from these medieval experiments in disease control. Venice's establishment of the first true quarantine system in 1423 represented a revolutionary approach to epidemic management. The legal system, too, felt the impact of these demographic disasters, with so many dying without heirs. Property law became incredibly complex. Courts found themselves overwhelmed with inheritance, disputes, claims from distant relatives, and questions about whether feudal obligations died with the feudal lords. The concepts of individual property rights and testamentary freedom gained ground as traditional inheritance patterns proved inadequate to the new reality. Perhaps most importantly, these diseases began to erode the medieval synthesis that had united faith and reason's spiritual and temporal authority. The Black Death arrived at the height of medieval civilization, when the great cathedrals were being completed, and scholastic philosophy had reached its most sophisticated development. The confidence of the High Middle Ages, the belief that human reason could understand God's plan, and that earthly society reflected divine order, was shattered by the apparent randomness and cruelty of epidemic disease. This crisis of confidence would eventually contribute to both the Renaissance and the Reformation. If the old certainties could be swept away by invisible pestilence, perhaps other certainties deserved questioning too. The humanistic emphasis on individual experience and empirical observation that characterized the Renaissance can be traced in part to the medieval experience of disease and social collapse. The Protestant Reformation's challenge to church authority similarly drew strength from the obvious failure of traditional religious responses to epidemic disease, when prayers, pilgrimages, and relics proved powerless against the plague. Some began to wonder whether the entire medieval religious system might need fundamental reform. As we stand at the threshold of concluding our exploration of medieval Europe's deadliest diseases, we must recognize that we're not simply examining medical history. We're witnessing the birth pangs of the modern world. The diseases that devastated medieval Europe didn't just kill millions. They killed the medieval worldview itself From the ashes of that devastation arose new ways of thinking about society, authority, individual rights, and humanity's relationship with both nature and the divine. The courage of those who survived these catastrophes, who rebuilt their communities and created new forms of social organization, represents one of history's greatest triumphs of human resilience. They faced challenges that would test any civilization, and not only survived, but laid the groundwork for the modern world we inhabit today. Their legacy reminds us that even in our darkest hours, human creativity and determination can forge new paths forward. The deadliest diseases of medieval times forever changed the course of human civilization, leaving indelible marks on society, culture, and consciousness that echo through the centuries to our modern world. From the catastrophic Black Death that swept away a third of Europe's population to the mysterious sweating sickness that struck without warning, these biological scourges shaped not just mortality rates, but entire worldviews. The medieval period witnessed humanity's struggle against invisible enemies that challenged primitive medical understanding, rooted in superstition and humoral theory, while simultaneously driving innovations in public health, quarantine practices, and hospital development. These diseases didn't discriminate between peasant and prince, yet their impacts varied dramatically across social strata, often exacerbating existing inequalities, while occasionally leveling social hierarchies through sheer devastation. The legacy of medieval pandemics extends far beyond death tolls, influencing art, literature, religious thought, and political structures in ways that fundamentally altered European civilization. The collective trauma of recurring plagues fostered a cultural preoccupation with mortality that permeated everything from cathedral architecture to popular literature, while survivors developed remarkable resilience and adaptive strategies that laid groundwork for modern medical practices. Perhaps most significantly, these diseases served as catalysts for social change, breaking down feudal structures, inspiring religious reforms, and ultimately contributing to the emergence of the Renaissance worldview that would reshape humanity's relationship with both science and spirituality. As we conclude this exploration of medieval Europe's deadliest diseases, we're reminded that these ancient scourges offer profound lessons for our contemporary world, where global pandemics continue to test human resilience and adaptability. The medieval experience with disease demonstrates both the fragility and remarkable durability of human societies, showing how communities can endure unimaginable suffering while emerging transformed, often stronger and more innovative than before. In studying these historical pandemics, we gain not only scientific knowledge, but also insight into the enduring human capacity for survival, adaptation, and renewal in the face of existential threats that seem